Welcome back to another edition of Irish Illustrated Insider. We have an unexpected two-man booth today. Pete Sampson from The Athletic joins me, Tim O'Malley, and Pete, AT&T Fiber Internet and MetroNet out in Granger have allowed us to continue on with this. There's been a lot of difficulty connecting with Tim Priester. I believe he has Comcast. Don't want to put them on blast too much right now. And John Bryce is on assignment for Football Scoop. So it's been a while since the two of us did this, I think, alone, Pete.
Yeah, I made fun of the 2-year AT&T construction project in my neighborhood, but who's laughing now?
Exactly. No, we're ready to roll. And we don't have to go to the library to do this podcast in
Yeah.
these situations either. Well, Pete and I were both at, as were the others, at Friday. We talked to defensive coordinator Chris Ash and offensive coordinator Mike Denbrock. A lot to glean from those. And I thought the defensive early enrollees were, you don't really compare them, but were really good interview subjects that we had on Saturday. Pete, what did you, I think maybe go with Denbrock or Ash first. What did you kind of take away from those? And we got them very early in spring, I guess. It would maybe been a little better if we got them later for some position battles.
Yeah, I was interested, Denbrock, mostly about, I think I asked him almost this was the way I phrased it, was like, does it feel like you're installing a new offense? Because like whoever wins the quarterback job, for the sake of this question, I don't care. But Riley Leonard was so different than those three guys. Is it a different playbook? And he was like, no, not really. Like a lot of the passing concepts will be the same. At which point I'm like, I hope that they're better, or at least more effective than they were last year. But he did acknowledge, like, look, that we got to reinvent the run game a little bit, and
Yeah.
and how people defend our run game is going to be so different too. So, I I'll be interested. This is probably more of an August question for Denbrock, and maybe he won't answer it, and then maybe we'll have a better conversation on this podcast in September about it. Just like how different the offense looks, and the other thing I want to know, like, what's your get out of jail free card? Like, we all knew on 3rd and 3 Riley Leonard was running the ball,
Right.
and if it got to 4th and 1, Riley Leonard was running the ball. Like, I wonder what this offense is so good at that the other team won't be able to stop it. I'm not sure if Denbrock knows quite yet.
It's a great point because no matter how strong your running offensive line will be better, more cohesive,
Yeah.
older running game just as good, if not better. Running backs just as good, if not better. But I hadn't really thought about that with the running game because Leonard changes everything. I mean, Jeremiah Love became a very good short yardage back. Aeneas Williams is a good short yardage back. Jabron Payne has proven he's a short yardage back. But Riley Leonard was better than all of them. I mean, Riley Leonard was an absolute machine. Georgia got him once on a 4th and 1 measurement that mattered. I'm sure there was one more stop, and I'm not remembering. It was probably against Northern Illinois, actually, when right before he got hurt, there was some hinky moments there in the running game. But by the time they got rolling, it was hard to stop Notre Dame in that position. And I kind of followed up with Denbrock. Uh, does it matter that you have, if you think of spring right now, they have 6 or 7 new wide receivers, Pauling, the 3 freshmen, and then the 3 guys that barely played last year in Micah Gilbert and Logan Saldate and Cam Williams. And they have 3 quarterbacks working in. I wondered if that hurts the cohesion at all. And he said something interesting. He's like, well, the receivers shouldn't care who a quarterback is. Run your route to the right depth, get open, catch the ball. Look at he said 100 times out of 100, you got to catch those balls that hit you in both hands. But the quarterbacks could care who the receivers are. And
Yeah, the receiver part I thought was really interesting because it was almost like I don't want to say he was being critical of Mike Brown, but it was close to it in the sense of like we weren't a confident group last year. Like
yeah, he
he
flat
was
out
not
said it.
pleased with how the receivers played last year based on 7 minutes with him last week. But it's rare that you I think would get that kind of like honest self assessment from a coordinator. So I just thought it was noteworthy the way he described the receiver room as like not even close to good enough. And how do they get there this year? Jaden Greathouse, obviously.
Yeah.
Will Pauling, I would be stunned if he wasn't productive for Notre Dame in a way that past grad transfers were not. And obviously Malachi Fields too. But it just I think the receiver room, I think we sort of assume they're going to be better because like they're older and like it's they're more talented, but it certainly didn't seem like Denbrock was just going to assume enough development was going to happen automatically.
And we'll have enough questions on quarterbacks to deal with in segment 2 where we get into that, where there's some good real queries. When do you have to name your starters just so you get your offense intact? I
Yeah.
mean, I think if it's Kenny Minchey, we'll table this, but if it's Kenny Minchey, which he's probably the least likely, but if it's Minchey, your offense changes because he can run better than the other two can. It's an automatic change there. I hadn't really thought about with Ash. I think a lot of us focused on because we talked to Botello and he offered some new stuff about pass rushing and from his outside technique, from his seven technique. I think Ash was a little surprised we had those detailed questions, and he basically, after answering them three times, mentioned, "Hey, it's a spring. It's not experiment." He didn't use the word experiment, but it's something we're trying to work with in the spring. Basically, it means the defensive ends line up wider and they get to tangle with some tight ends instead of tackles at all times. And we'll find out what the drop pick is. I don't think that's a new thing you'll be watching, Pete, when you're charting your games every single time, which where the defensive end lines up.
No, no, I won't be putting that down on my notepad. But yeah, Ash was pretty upfront. Like, and I wanted to ask him this directly, and I didn't get a chance to. It's like when you get hired as a DC, isn't there some expectation that you're going to be able to like figure out your staff on your own? And like clearly that was not the case here, which he seemed totally fine with. I don't like he's not going to say the alternative, but like it is a really good defensive staff.
Yes.
And just like how often that happens in football where the coordinator inherits the staff and is like, awesome, thanks, head coach. Like great job with this. I gotta think that's really rare.
Well, he said he hit the coaching lottery with the
Yeah.
players and the coaches, and I think just imagine having Mickens watching. This is a question we asked when he got hired. Well, what's going to happen now with Mickens and Biaggi and how they're going to split up duties? It's simple. They're not changing their duties. Chris Ash gets to roam, and I thought that was a great question by Priester, actually. Is this the first time in his life he has not coached a position? It is. Other than being a head coach, that's got to be a benefit. When you're not coaching a position, he can go to he pointed out I can go to any meeting room I want to go to. I can help them teach a drill the way I want it taught, things like that. Those are the tweaks I think that happen after Al Golden.
Yeah, and I remember talking to Marcus about this when Al Golden was being hired. Like he didn't want the sort of the floating defensive coordinator, which I think Al Golden ultimately did.
I think he did.
And he was just like, "This is how I like to do it, so I'm going to do it." But yeah, I think it's probably the best way for Ash to get up to speed with everybody, like their strengths and weaknesses as coaches, their communication styles, what they actually think of their roster. So yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense to do it that way. And I think Ash, and he said this in his opening press conference, right? Like, I'm not here to sort of essentially like I'm not here to reinvent the wheel.
Yeah.
Like I'm not going to break what doesn't need to be fixed or fix what's not broken or whatever that phrase is. Like he seems, you know, self-aware, which like I think a lot of these coaches come in and they're like, I know everything, like I have all the answers, and he doesn't come across that way at all.
He did say he's like the concepts are the concepts, the fronts are the fronts. We're not changing too many things, but I'm glad he mentioned like, yeah, we can enhance some things because a new idea can enhance things. And Al Golden was going to have to enhance some things. They didn't do everything perfectly. They had an amazing defense and the best defensive coordinator for well, he deserved to win it. He won it, and they ran up against the other best defensive coordinator in the country in that
Yeah.
game, who happened to have a better offense going against Al Golden's defense was probably the issue. But yeah, I thought Ash. I hadn't met him yet because I just had seen his video from when I was on vacation, and he did come off like, look, we got it rolling here right now, but it's going to be interesting after this year. They'll lose more personnel that was kind of key to that run last year. Then you'll probably see some more tweaks from him that are visible. There's going to be millions of tweaks. We're just not going to know any of them, and I think he knows that. Chris Ash knows we're not going to be able to understand all his little tweaks he has. Priester also asked him, "Is the defense a 4-2-5 now?" And I think Ash got caught up a little bit in the semantics of it, and he's like, "Oh, it's a nickel game," and then he explained how all the fronts can change. But that was our question: Is it a nickel game? It's still a nickel game. That's not a huge surprise.
Yeah, nothing has changed there. Notre Dame is recruited for that, mostly out of the portal,
Yeah.
but and they've done a good job with it. So there's I don't know what the percentages of snaps, but I think it was well over 50% in nickel last year, and that's I don't see any way that's going to change in 2025. Like the game is where it is,
Yeah.
and so that's like. And then in some ways, I feel like Notre Dame's offense forced you out of nickel last year. But the common approach is going to be nickel, and with Devonta Smith, who was among the defensive early
Yep.
enrollees or mid-year enrollees that we talked to on Saturday, it seems like they're in pretty good hands there.
Yeah. I enjoyed talking. I spoke with Dawson. First question I asked Jared Dawson was, how much does the team mention last year's Louisville game and how quickly do you respond with the season before's outcome? And he's like, oh, right away, all the time. And I remind him every single time. So I enjoyed talking to Dawson. I asked him about, he rotated heavily at Louisville. And he kind of talked, he had a good theory on it. And I think you subscribe to this too. He's like defensive tackle, defensive end. I added running backs in the conversation. Like now people know you have to rotate at that position or you're simply not as good of a football player as the season progresses.
Yeah, that's a eight. You need eight players on the defensive line to rotate. And I talked to another one, Elijah Hughes, who I guess I didn't recognize him at first because he's, I think, sort of among the mid-year or grad transfer, or I guess he's not a grad transfer, just the transfers. Maybe like the least of the renowned guys.
Right. Right.
But I mean, it was interesting about like the transfer process. He said, like, I heard nightmares of guys who were seniors and they show up in their first semester sophomore because their stuff doesn't transfer. And so I was like, well, what did you study? And he was like, I was finance and accounting. I'm like, well, they have that at Notre Dame, so you're good. But he was just like, look, I wanted to come to a place like Notre Dame out of high school. I just wasn't frankly good enough to get an offer. And yeah, it's, I think he talked about how maybe there'd be some packages for him to be a defensive end, but he's an interior guy. Certainly like well put together. I think that even though he's not like an adult in the way that Jared Dawson or Jalen Stroman or Devonta Smith are, you can tell he's not a mid-year early enrollee either. So if he's your fourth defensive tackle, I think you're probably in good shape.
Yeah.
Maybe he's your fifth, but either way, like it seems like he will be a value add to the defense. I talked to Jalen Stroman, who does look like a full-grown adult.
Yes, he does.
And was again, I think he said he looked at USC a little bit as a grad transfer, a couple other schools too, maybe Virginia. I'm not sure if that's right, but he was just like, look, I saw the defense last year. It was interesting, like Stroman in particular. It's almost like they committed to Notre Dame sight unseen. They're just like, they're good. I want to be good. And I think one thing that's probably developed, as much as Marcus talks about, you want to major in high school recruiting and the minor in the portal. Like they have hit at such a high rate in the portal that now it's not the same as like we're tight end U or DBU, but like if Notre Dame's grad transfer you, like I think they're fine with that because now grad transfers know like that's a place where you can go and have success. Maybe it doesn't turn you into a high draft pick per se, but you're going to get to play a lot on a really good team, and people are going to notice. So I think that was sort of interesting to me that these guys were like, yeah, the transfers here have basically all hit. I want to have that experience too, and Notre Dame's a place where I can have it.
I'd asked Dawson that exact question. It's like, why Notre Dame? I asked all the defensive guys, even and the freshmen, of course, too. Like when Al Golden leaves, what's your reaction?
Yeah.
Of course, well, Al Golden was pretty popular for all of them, but Jared Dawson was just like, I came to Notre Dame to win a national championship. I watched them play in the national championship game last year.
Yes, Stroman was the same way. He's
Yeah.
just like, I asked him about Golden leaving. He's like, whatever.
Yeah, yeah.
It's like it really had nothing to do with anything.
It's an
He
interesting
barely said that
dynamic.
Mickens had anything to do with it.
That is intriguing. Yeah.
He's like, I've enjoyed getting to know him. He's a really good coach, but like, I came to Notre Dame because like this is a place where look, and there is a certainly an NIL subtext there, right? But like Notre Dame is well armed, let's say. But I think the reputation of that's a place where you can go and win and develop is really important.
I mean, if I was Notre Dame, I'd be touting every second. Mike Mickens has developed Kyle Hamilton, Xavier Watts, Benjamin Morrison, Leonard Moore. I'd be saying that every minute. Maybe Stroman doesn't. I'm sure Stroman just thinks he's better than all of them because that's what high level college football players feel, and that's how they have to feel. I didn't talk to Thomas, and I don't think you did either. But Priester will have an interview with Cree Thomas. I know he. Apparently, I didn't even see this part of it because we were talking to different guys, but I guess he gave a great interview with television. Apparently, Cree Thomas speaks like he's a 25-year-old, if not looks like one.
I went out to Phoenix to talk to him. It was for an alumni event. And I was like, I'll just go by Brophy Prep and spend some time with Cree Thomas. And yeah, he was a second semester junior. He was like after a track practice. And he's like 25 years old. I mean, he doesn't look like he's 25, but he speaks like he's 25. He was a decathlete, which like speaks really well to his athleticism. Like he was in some ways like a better fit for Notre Dame than Benjamin Morrison, both coming out of the same Brophy prep
Hmm.
program. Yeah, that is an. I don't know how good he'll be at Notre Dame, but he is somebody with like such a high floor. We'll see where the ceiling goes,
Yeah.
and the high floor is based on like he's just such an easy fit for this place.
I have three other guys, high floor and high ceiling, excuse me. Madden Faremo also does not look like a 18-year-old
No,
freshman, but I think it's because I've been watching him now at Notre Dame for 3 months, which I did talk to him about. I was like, you were here for every practice, for not a bowl game like CJ Carr, for every practice for a playoff run for 2 months. Like, what was that situation like? He's like, honestly, it was it's the size and the speed that I noticed at the games and things, but it's the attention to detail in practice, which I think is a great point for a player that can play as a freshman. That's what he has to get down. Um, I still think he's the crown jewel of this class, and not only because he signed on the last day. That's always makes it more fun. But I really believe he was my number one rated player in the class.
if healthy though, right? Like
Yes,
that's
yeah, no, it's he still has the wrap on his hand. It was taped, not. I think he wears a brace when he practices, but it was taped when he came to talk to us. So
yeah,
I
that's
think it's a double duty.
it does seem like it's been an ongoing thing. So we'll see. And look, it's if he could whatever he gives him this fall is probably a bonus. Like they don't necessarily need it,
Yeah, not
but
KVA level. I'm just saying,
no.
get in there and play. That was
Yeah, I think he would be a fine person to watch covering an opening kickoff
yeah.
at Miami in a Bryce Young KVA kind of way.
Also, a tall guy that might do that is Jadon Blair, who I can confirm is tall.
Yeah,
He remains tall. He towers. I mean, if he grows more, it's going to have to be the old, okay, you, Mr. 6'6" outside linebacker soon. Just time to put on some weight because he's a big guy. And he said he enjoyed his time playing wide receiver on the scout team, getting Notre Dame ready for the playoffs. Maybe a little too much detail in Al Golden's defense to throw him into the mix during that. So that's why he was over there. But it's been all safety ever since. And he did mention he's at free safety, a spot where you can kind of come down the alley and hit. So I could see that happening for Jadon Blair in year two. It's,
yeah, that would be. Like, is there? You meant the opening kickoff. Like he'd be a big guy that would be on it. Yeah, it'd be interesting to sort of see like what if there is a role at some point for him this year
right.
on defense
On
because
defense, yeah, he'll play special teams in some
because
way.
like the physicality there is unique. Like there just aren't a lot of Jadon Blairs running around. That doesn't mean that he's going to be the next Harrison Smith or David Bruton as a throwback, but
Harrison
it's
Smith's a bit of a throwback too, Pete, but he
something.
kept going. Yes.
There's some uniqueness to the way Jadon Blair is put together, and this like you got to think that the staffs would be like, are we really not going to play this guy like, at
Right.
all? We got to find something for him, but it's got to be a small something.
Hey, it took Harrison Smith about three too many years to hit, though, if you think about it that way, because they moved him. Speaking of linebackers, they moved the wrong guy to linebacker at that
Yeah.
one point. Brian Kelly's best ever line is Harrison Smith a safety or linebacker? What? He just looked at the reporter like, what's wrong with you? He's playing safety on this team. And I don't think he was trying to be funny on this one, actually. Pete, other than missed layups, any commentary from the weekend of watching a Sweet 16 bow out for the fourth straight season?
This is probably the first time I watched it a little bit more closely. And I think for a backcourt with Citron Hidalgo and Miles that was supposed to be like this is the one of the best, if not the best in the country. I think they shot a combined 10 of 44. You're right, a lot of missed layups, and yeah, Badlith was phenomenal. I Yeah, it's like women's basketball is sort of they need this. This was the season they needed to take another step forward. I'm not comparing it to like Marcus taking the step forward he did in year three, but like Niel needed more this year than what was delivered. And I mean, it just like the roster could completely flip over next year, with the exception of Hidalgo. But man, it's to go from number one in the country to out in the Sweet 16. What they finished, 5-4 or something down the stretch. Like that was a brutal finish to what. And I thought, Citron's quote after the game of like, we almost had too much talent. We didn't know what to do with it is like, when you hear that, you're like,
Yeah,
man,
that hurts.
the pieces were not maximized and the players, they're speaking that out into existence.
We got news as we were going to podcast for the first time ever, Pete Sampson, instead of right after we finished, that Frank Reich will be Stanford's interim coach. Not a name I thought Notre Dame would be coaching against in January, but a lot of things have changed on the farm. 1 year for Frank Reich, elevating their tight ends coach to offensive coordinator, and he will be the play caller as well. I mean, it's Notre Dame relevant news. It probably will galvanize Stanford a little bit. I just don't know how much you could do with that roster.
Can they move the game to the Rose Bowl now?
Yeah, 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 yeah. It'd be nice.
Now that Troy Taylor doesn't have anything to prove.
Now they have to do it.
Yeah, I mean that the whole story out there is completely bizarre to me. That one, it took 3 years for this to come out, especially after he had been an assistant there before.
Yeah, that's an interesting. I can't see with the accusations against him, the way he treated staffers. I can't see him all of a sudden just doing that because he was the head coach.
Yeah. So yeah, moral of the story: don't be a jerk. Frank Reich. I mean, if I was Stanford, I'd say that's as good as you're going to get. We got this former NFL head coach to come in and just steady things for a year, but it's a shame we don't have Priester on here because maybe he's going out to do an interview with David Bailey. I don't know. You got to have it. You got to have players at some point, and Stanford is down on players.
Yeah, that's maybe David Bailey stays now. I prefer though. The first question should be to Frank Reich. We get a call in from South Bend, Indiana. Coach, is there any thoughts to moving the Notre Dame game at season's end to the Rose Bowl? I'd be like, what are you guys talking? He was completely off of his radar, I would assume, the entire time. But hey,
Got other things to worry about.
more interesting than Troy Taylor. I will have to get back with my friend who's the father of their former quarterback, Ashton Daniels, who's transferred to Auburn. Interesting, by the way, Stanford to Auburn. So I'll see if I can get a little bit of
Yeah,
insight.
it's like I mean their quarterback group basically cleared out. I think even
Yeah,
the backup went to drop down a level, maybe to FCS.
probably good.
Yeah, so that's I don't know. It in the modern era of college football, it doesn't take a lot for things to fall apart, and it is really hard to put them back together. And I think Stanford is staring; they're looking into the abyss at this point.
Looking to upgrade your wardrobe? Founded by Notre Dame alum Go Wang, you've seen ESQ's custom clothing on the player walk and all of your favorite players and coaches. With more than a decade of making the best bespoke clothing available, ESQ will help you look and feel your best. From a perfect fitting suit or sport coat, shirt or bomber jacket, or that perfect tuxedo for wedding season, check out esqclothing.com and book an appointment to upgrade your wardrobe today. Mention Irish Illustrated and get 10% off your entire purchase. That's esqclothing.com. We'll be back with segment two, Burning Up the Boards. Welcome back to segment two, Burning Up the Boards. Our first question comes from Twitter, Coach MDD. What date would be so late as to negatively impact the eventual QB1's time running the ones in prep for a tough set of season openers? Would it thus be advantageous for one of the three to transfer prior to camp, so that would probably be in April, thus splitting pre-QB1 selection reps by two, not three?
Well, only one could transfer prior to camp if we're into August because Angeli would be a graduate, I think.
Probably, he would
But
think.
Carr and Minchie would not, so they're stuck. I would say I don't know if there is a too late time. Like I think there's a too late time, like as we discuss this in March 31st and for the next 4 months.
Yeah.
But this is like I haven't brought this up on this podcast, but I think it's worth noting. I think it was 2018 at Cincinnati. Mike Denbrock is the offensive coordinator. They have a returning starter at quarterback, wins the job. They go to UCLA. Kid really struggles. They pull the cord on him and put in Desmond Ritter after 3 series. Three
Three
series.
series. Wow.
Like by the end of the first quarter, they had made a quarterback switch. So
That's more than Notre Dame did with Kristen Reese.
yeah, so it's like that's always been in the back of my mind when I think about like, hey, who's going to start the season, who's going to finish the season? Like Denbrock has been and worked for a guy who is not afraid to change quarterbacks. So I don't like. Would it be great if at the end of training camp, midway through August, they're like, boom, CJ Carr, you're a starter, Angeli, you're a starter, Minch, you're a starter. Yeah, that'd be great. But if they don't say that, if they don't know, I don't think it is like an albatross on the season per se. Because like if they start a guy and it doesn't work, they'll change it. They're not going to just keep banging their head against a wall.
Also, I don't think it was officially said ever, but I do think number three if he's planning a transfer, is going to transfer after April because they're going to let number three know he might be on the outside looking in, unless it's the strangest setup in the world where they just don't know that one of their players is on the outside looking in. But as Gaduli and Denbrock have said, players know more than you think they do. Like
Oh
most of
yeah.
them are self-aware and know where they stand, and the ones that don't probably aren't going to play anyway.
You know what players see that we don't? Every practice.
Yeah, and the film critiques, right, of what their
Yeah.
practices are.
I mean, they're like, hey, I'm not getting any number one reps anymore. What happened? Like, they're this is pretty smart guys.
Yeah. All right, Sam. So this is your question. I like this one.
Kevin O'Neill, will Tyler Buckner make the 105-man roster?
I had never considered this until reading the question. It's a great one. When one quarterback transfers, Tyler Buckner will be valuable to the 105-man roster. If somehow one quarterback doesn't transfer, Buckner is the fifth QB. He could be the starting every week scout team QB though, and certainly the guy that can run in and do some stuff on special teams. I don't think I don't know how much he would play at receiver when you're whittling it down already now. Not, I don't mean play. He wouldn't play at all, but how much he would rotate in at wide receiver. I think long-winded Buckner will make the roster, but if a quarterback transfers, Buckner becomes a player on the roster that they need in the room for scout team and everything else.
I think that my educated guess is the ideal ending for Tyler Buckner is he's QB4. Like one guy leaves,
Yeah.
Buckner's like, "Hey, hand up, I'll go into that room." Not that I want to play, like yeah, I want to play, but like I want to go into coaching. You see the game differently in the quarterback room than you do in the wide receiver room. I feel like I can either contribute on the scout team point of view, but I also can get better in terms of preparing myself for like life after football. Because if I want to go into coaching or like that's an option for me, you want to go in as a quarterback, not as a wide receiver who never played.
Also, funny moment, Pete. I think you were there. Jack, at one point in the rain, opened the door for some players, and it was open for me as well. But I opened the door. You can't see who you opened the door for in the rain, and open it up, and there's Tyler Buckner running in. Just like, hey, everybody, talk to the media very briefly. Runs into practice over from lacrosse. I thought that. I don't know if you were there yet, Pete. I thought that
No,
was
I
a
was
strange,
there.
very strange moment while you're waiting to go to interviews. Tyler Buckner comes running in, obviously coming over from the lacrosse field. Next question is Irish from A2. How would you compare Cam Williams and Tobias Merriweather at this point in their careers?
I mean, I mean, Tobias Merriweather was way ahead of Cam Williams. Tobias Merriweather had the touchdown against Stanford
Yep. Yep.
in a game that will go down in history as no, it won't go down in any history at all.
What in history is you needed him to score that touchdown,
Yeah,
though,
but
actually.
he did something, and toward the end of the year, we were told by the staff that like they were going to move him into the starting lineup, and they got concussed in practice,
Yeah.
and that
When he
essentially
should not have been.
yeah, when he should not have been, and that essentially ended his season. But Tobias Merriweather could have ended the season with like 3 or 4 starts,
Right.
maybe 10, 12 catches. Cam Williams has not got on the field in a meaningful way.
And Tobias Merriweather at this exact point would have been exiting a spring soon where I think every writer had Tobias Merriweather in the top 30 players on the team, even though we were wrong.
Yeah, it was
Uh,
like
he was a starter.
I remember like you'd get questions about like, hey, if there was a player who had a breakout season, who would be like name the players whose breakout season would impact Notre Dame the most. And like Tobias Merriweather was in that conversation.
Yes.
Cam Williams is not.
Tobias was also on I will say, not as good of a receiving core because the players that were better than him were Greathouse and Flores below him. And they became better. You just didn't know it at the time in the spring. Lenzy was gone, right? Yeah, Lenzy decided not to play. That was a That was a really bad wide receiver room. And remember, Tobias Merriweather, for all the people that kind of we got sick of talking about Merriweather because fans had the weird expectations about him. But I want people to remember one thing Tobias did right. Like the guy had a messed up hamstring, and he would still play that whole Duke game because they had three receivers
Yeah.
that could walk in that game where Mitchell Evans became the star of that. So Merriweather at this point things went south, but he had a okay start to the career. It was just kind of strange that people were just yearning for him off, like he was going to fix the whole offense in his freshman year. And I think Tommy Reese was even like, there's a lot going on, and it's you line up in the wrong spot, you can't keep putting the guy back in.
Next up, K. Garrity 8. Over the past couple seasons, we have seen recruiting in different positional groups improve greatly. Defensive backs, linebackers, running backs, even quarterbacks. Between defensive line and wide receiver, which group is the most important to make that jump to win it all? Can they win with a status quo wide receiver room, but an amped up defensive line group? Or is offense the name of the game and defensive line group can be sufficient?
I think everybody listening would agree if Jeremiah Smith didn't exist with what I'm about to say. I think the defensive line is much more important to amp up than the wide receivers because I do believe a group with Fields, Pauling, Greathouse, Faison, and then a couple better guys that could have been brought in to go along with that would be sufficient in a wide receiver room. You cannot beat Georgia, Penn State, and Ohio State in a row if you don't have a really good defensive line. And one of the reasons Notre Dame didn't was they had an injured defensive line at that point. I mean, Ohio State was better, but it did not help that they didn't have Riley Mills, that they
No.
had lost a little depth. Howard Cross couldn't really move. I say defensive line, and you can patchwork wide receivers that are not quite day two NFL ready picks like Malachi Fields, more so than anything else.
I think you're probably right. I'd say 10 years ago, I would have dismissed this question as like, well, it's defensive line. You got to be like joking. Now I wouldn't. I think you could engage in the conversation here about like, you could make an argument for wide receiver. I don't think it would be a great argument. But if we go back to my favorite Joe Burrow 60 touchdown catch season,
Yes.
it was Jamar Chase and Jordan Jefferson, and I think I'm forgetting another first round pick that they had. So if you've got that going for you, or like those Alabama teams that like, oh, their quarterbacks are incredible. Well, their wide receivers won the Heisman Trophy. Like their third, their Michael Young, as we joke about, is a first round pick.
Jalen Waddle.
Jalen Waddle, like Notre Dame isn't even close to that. So it's like I think you can have a conversation about like if you had a Golden Tate and Michael Floyd, or you had a Will Fuller and a peak Chase Claypool going together,
hmm
um, maybe you could argue for wide receiver.
That's a good point. You could not have possibly done it years ago, but now you can. And for people that don't know the reference, I was watching the national championship game once when Jalen Waddle, Alabama's backup wide receiver, caught a slant and went 80 yards, and Pete Sampson texted me, "That's their Michael Young," and that's when I defined that we could figure out the definition of separation.
Yeah, well, I mean, Emeka Buka was
Yeah,
wide receiver too.
yeah,
He was a pretty good player.
that's terrible. When I realized he was coming back, and I think it was like last February, not January, when it was announced, I was like, "Oh, come on! How is this humanly possible? That guy's coming back for more of Notre Dame." Great question from Hayden Adam Z, and it's a shame that Tim Priester's not on here because he does have the pronunciation correct, and we miss it a lot. Is it a bear like Bobby, or Hebert like someone sloppily identifying their friend Bert?
I was told it's Hebert,
Right, it is Hebert. Yes.
but I want it to also be Balake. If you know, you
Yes.
know on that joke.
If you know, you know exactly. A bear is hard not to say because I grew up in that era, and the 49ers played Bobby Hebert.
I
twice a
think
year.
a co-host of this podcast actually referred to him as a bear,
A bear at
maybe
one
to
point.
his face. But I think he was polite and just rolled with it.
Either way, just look up the Seinfeld clip where George talks about Bobby Aber, and he would give you a better answer than we could right here. This
All
one
right.
from go ahead.
DJSJNNDFB. Okay, I got all the letters right. What's the deal with David Bailey?
Speaking of Seinfeld, good way to
Yeah.
read it. David Bailey, the Stanford transfer, is in the portal. Tim Priester has had unrequited film review affections for David
It's like
Bailey.
the
coming
Brennan
to-
Armstrong of defensive ends.
Yes, he's a very important person on this podcast for the last couple of years. However, when we originally cited David Bailey as a guy not in the portal that should be tampered with by Irish Illustrated to enter the portal, Notre Dame needed more help because we didn't know about Boubacar Traore, and Jordan Botelho was a vagabond playing random positions.
Yeah, it's to getting back to the Kay Garrity question about like which group must improve. Like, I think we'd have to argue that defensive end has improved because we're talking about David Bailey as surplus to requirements, and David Bailey is a hell of a good player.
Yeah, it's in the I always have liked the dog eat dog world of, well, bring on David Bailey and cut somebody else. I have no problem with that because I don't have to cut the person, and I am that's how I kind of view the sport. But you're paying him a lot too. I don't know, and Pete, we talked about this off the air. How much are you paying David Bailey considering you are clearly going to be paying Traore? Patel is probably not that bad of a price tag because he had nowhere else to go with the injury. He's a valuable player, but Bryce Young will command quite a hefty sum at the end of next season, if not already. Obviously, not a huge transfer risk, but the problem with David Bailey is you are now paying, as Pete said, surplus, where it just
Yeah.
seems crazy.
Yeah, it's I don't it just doesn't seem like a great use of funds there. And if you're David Bailey, I would think that you could look at a dozen other programs that they do need you in a way that Notre Dame doesn't. And again, that's I say that as a compliment to Notre Dame's defensive end recruiting and development.
Yeah, I mean, if they're not healthy, David Bailey's the best Viper on the team. But if Traore's healthy,
Yeah, that's
Bubakar's
he's a
that's
rotational player.
next from Caden McFarland. And I had not looked at the quarterback competition this way at all, but definitely should have, since all we do is talk about quarterback competitions. If Kenny Minchey is clearly the best running QB, isn't he likely the best option to maximize the final season of Jeremiah Love and a possibly elite run blocking O line? I'd love to see ND finally become an elite passing offense too, but in my lifetime, the best ND teams all run like the Dickens. Wow, his lifetime just went back a few more decades than I
Yes,
thought. Caden.
I didn't know that Caden McFarland was an 85-year-old man. Um, I would I disagree because what's the best way to give Jeremiah Love more running room? Let's move guys out of the box. Let's force the nickelback to play 10 yards off the ball and the safeties to play not like Dylan Tierman levels depth, but like deep. And if that's the case, then yeah, that's how I think you open things up for Jeremiah Love is like you have a legitimate passing game, which goes back to the first thing we talked about with Mike Denbrock in the offense. He's like, we've got to be able to sting you when you bring that defender down. And we couldn't last year. Jaden Greathouse, Malachi Fields, Will Pauling, whoever it is, Eli Raridon, they've got to do a better job of that. So I look at it differently from McFarland, although I understand historically there is some precedent of like when Notre Dame has three 800-yard rushers, they're usually playing for the national championship. But I'm not sure that's where football wants to stay in
Yeah,
2025.
it's a great point. I want to be fair to Kenny Minchey, and this goes back to your point, the players see every practice that we don't. We haven't seen Kenny Minchey and CJ Carr throw enough against each other to truly 100% know who has the best arm talent on the team. Like, we assume it's CJ Carr because of what it looked like when we watched CJ Carr throw. But I've seen Kenny Minchey throw fewer balls than really anyone going into his junior year I can recall. I just didn't see a lot of Minchey in my life in the practices because we've seen fewer practices. He definitely is the best runner of the group. So Pete, if he is passer 1B, then that's a different question because he's clearly runner 1 and there's somebody 2.
Yeah, I mean I don't know
I
the
assume
difference
Angeli's the
between
worst runner, right, of the 3. I
yeah,
assume it's Angeli.
that's I think clear. I think that the difference between Minchie and Leonard as a runner is so vast
Right. Right.
that I think this question sort of like holds on to like, well, we had a running quarterback last year. How about we have a running quarterback this year? It's like, no, 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 no. Like Riley Leonard was a elite running quarterback.
Like we
And I
assume
don't,
Buckner was a much better runner than Kenny Minchey.
yes, I think that's true too. I think that if Mike Denbrock finally can call games the way he wants to call them, opposed to having to call them in 2025, which is like kind of where the offense has to go. I think that the running threat of the quarterback needs to be more of a bonus than a feature.
Yeah.
It was a feature last year. Would it be a feature with Minchie? I don't know. Again, we haven't seen enough. I do like what little we've seen from Carr, his ability to move around in the pocket and like run behind, like run to throw. There's a lot of value to that too.
And then one final point on that is Will Howard beat Notre Dame with his legs accidentally. It was a great game plan that he was going to run and beat Notre Dame with that. But the reason that also is available is because you have recruited wide receivers and running backs that are absolutely unstoppable when you have a quarterback that can throw well, which is what Will Howard did for the entire playoffs up until he went to the combine, apparently. But that, I mean, that was what pressured Notre Dame's defense. They would not have cared if you had a worse passing quarterback and a less than Riley Leonard runner back there than Will Howard. That would have helped Notre Dame's defense
Yeah, I agree.
if you're game planning against it.
Yeah, I mean, I think we talked about this a bunch. Like Will Howard and Riley Leonard both went to the right program.
Yes.
Like if you flipped them, that neither of them would have been as productive at the other spot. So yeah, I don't know how Denbrock will see that moving forward. All right, last question from G Byrne. With the length and number of snaps a lot of players had in the 24 season, a shortened recovery and winter conditioning program, limited reps for key players in spring because of that, which will contribute to developing cohesion along the offensive line. Are you concerned? One, about the cohesion and condition issues with the on paper very difficult first half of the 2025 season. And two, are you concerned because of the length of the 24 season that the team may start to run out of gas on the back half of 2025?
I liked this question because of number two. I am never going to be concerned again about the cohesion of a beginning of the season because of how Notre Dame's offensive line and offense somehow won it at Texas A&M with an offensive line that was put together in its final version with what, 10 days left, Pete?
Yeah.
And it was put together with freshmen and redshirt freshmen and a quarterback that did not practice with his team in the spring and part of the summer and a bunch of new guys. And a new offensive coordinator. Like the back half though of the season, it is a great question to ask Lauren Landau. How are you preparing this team for next January when you're just now recovering from last January?
Yeah, and it's like, does the time off, like, are you losing something in like putting on weight or like your conditioning, or are you gaining something by getting your body all the way to recover? Emil Wagner talked about, even though he's not taking team contact reps, he's getting extra lift in with Lando. So I think there's something intentional there. I did ask a colleague of mine at the Athletic who covers Ohio State, like, what are they doing? And he's like, well, they lost so many guys that they don't have a ton to hold back on. But he said Jeremiah Smith, Igu Boson, and Caleb Downs are all like hands off during spring practice. Yeah. As the colleague of mine that covers Penn State, she said James Franklin hasn't really come out and said it, but it's common practice to get starters out in spring ball. So, yeah, it's interesting. I look in the NFL. What's the running like? If you make the Super Bowl and lose, you never make the playoffs the next year. Yeah. Like, is that a thing in college now? Because the playoffs are much more like the NFL than they used to be. I don't know. I think it's a good question. It's a fair question about like, is there going to be a price to be paid for 2024 in 2025? I think the answer is yes. It's just a matter of how you pay it in a smart way.
Right. Yeah, there is a price. You can overcome it, or you can make good on it. But there is a price to pay for it. And I go back to wrap it up. We asked Rudolph a lot about when do can you get your best five? You can't figure out your best five in the spring because so many guys are out. And he basically he reiterated, I don't need that right now. I want Billy Schrauth to go lift. Do not miss your lifts. Be here. Be present when you can be. But don't come here and take mental reps when you could get strength gains, weight gains. And I think that's what Emil Wagner was talking about as well. Like you can still improve as a athlete, even if you're not going to be at left guard next to Styles Prescott at this point during practice, because that's what you're looking at. It's just shuffling and reshuffling. So when Rudolph reiterated a few times that I want these guys to lift and get stronger, I think that's kind of how they're handling it too when you're absent from practices.
And that's like, he made a good point about like, I think there's been a kind of a fan base concern about like they're not taking advantage of the 15 practices. What about the 15 practices? And Rudolph's like, hey, we had 21 extra practices and 3 extra games
after the bowl game. He called IU the bowl game. Yeah.
Emil Wagner just went through the most brutal spring practice of all time. It just happened in January instead of March and April. And I think that's something you got to keep reminding yourself of, is like, they played 3 extra games, and it wasn't like they played Miami of Ohio and New Mexico. They played Georgia, Penn State, and Ohio State, and it on top of the practices. In addition to that, so I have very little concern that Notre Dame's offensive line, whatever configuration it comes out with, and I'm assuming it. Let's just say it's Knapp, Jagasaw, Shrouth, Wagner, Craig.
Hmm.
Or if Craig's not ready, it's Lambert and Knapp as your center. I have zero concern like that line's not going to be ready to go against Miami, like none.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. My whole point is, will they be ready to go against Alabama in January 18th? But you know what? You just found out if you are. That's fine. Go play them right there. Pete, when you mentioned that final thing, when you mentioned Georgia, Penn State, Ohio State gauntlet, other than playing Notre Dame, what's one of those three teams? You couldn't have found three more physical teams to play.
No,
Like Notre Dame would be the other team to put in there, and of course Texas. Those are the teams there at the end. That is a brutal thing to fight through for Emil Wagner. 990 snaps, Emil Wagner. Take some time off, man. We'll be back on Thursday, April 3rd. If my date's correct. April 3rd for another podcast. Before that, I believe we have linebackers. Max Bull is always one of the better interviews on Wednesday. At some point, we will have the corners and special team or defensive backs and special teams this week as well for interviews. And then on the 5th, on Saturday the 5th, is of course the Jersey scrimmage, and we will have Marcus Freeman, not for the final time, but for the kind of the most important post game, I think, post practice press conference of the spring season. Until then, for Pete Sampson, the Athletic, I'm Tim O'Malley. Thanks for joining Irish Illustrated Insider.